Messianic Judaism is this tradition that's trying to find a way for Jews to live authentically as Jews and followers of Jesus. But it's kind of a messy movement. Like the whole movement is like kind of one big identity crisis because like, hello, like we're trying to just figure this out. And so you have kind of a spectrum. You have one end of the spectrum in Messianic Judaism feels a lot like Christianity with sort of some Jewish trappings, like maybe there's congregations, Messianic Jewish congregations. So of course, then you get the Messianic Jewish congregational movement. You have some that meet on Sundays, feels a lot like a church. Maybe they say a couple Hebrew blessings. And then all the way at the other end of the spectrum, you have like very, very Jewish, Messianic Jewish congregations.
Hey, welcome back everyone to the podcast. We've got another excellent episode for you today. My guest is Dr. Jennifer Rosner. Jen is an affiliate professor of systematic theology at Fuller Theological Seminary. She's one of the first, maybe the first theologian I've had on. So you can be on the show if you're a theologian, but you have to be a cool person. That's the rule. Jen also holds academic posts at the King's University, Azusa Pacific University, and Messianic Jewish Theological Institute. We are indeed here to talk about Messianic Judaism. This is a topic that I'm, of course, interested in as a Jewish follower of Jesus, and Jen is as well. She's also part of the International Coordinating Committee for Yachad B'Yeshua, which is an international community of Jews who are united in Christ, in Jesus, the Messiah, and many of whom are academics. So I'm very excited to get more involved with them and what they're doing, and really grateful to Jen for reaching out to me initially. A couple of her books that we get into in the conversation. One is Healing the Schism, Karl Barth, Franz Rosenzweig, and the New Jewish Christian Encounter. That comes out of Jen's published dissertation, where she looks at Jewish-Christian relations really throughout the millennia. More popular level writing that she's done that might be of interest to some, I think is a really great book, is Finding Messiah, A Journey into the Jewishness of the Gospel. So that's a book you might want to check out. I will have a link posted to Jen's books in the description. Also encourage you, I'm going to post a link to her website, jenrosner.com. You can find a lot of really excellent stuff she's done there. Contact information for her, but a lot of her popular writing is made available there. So encourage you to check that out and to support her. Before we jump into our conversation, I want to give a shout out to the newest member of the Center for Bible Study, Didi Gunther. Didi, thank you so much for your generous contribution and for making videos like this possible. So just as a way of reminder, you can become a member of the Center for Bible Study with any monthly contribution you make. It could be $1, $5, whatever it is that you want. Your membership gets you entrance into all future Center for Bible Study classes, as well as you get the archives of all past classes. We do recordings, so you get the recordings, the PowerPoints, and the notes. We're just now midway through a class on atonement, so if that's interesting to you, you can get all the recordings for that by becoming a member, as well as entrance into all future classes. So I think it's a really great deal. Along with, we'll give you a shout out just like this, and you'll get a monthly newsletter. So if you're interested in biblical studies and maybe you don't have the time to be taking classes, but you want to be a part of what we're doing, right? We're teaching 4 to 6 week classes on a regular basis. I do it here at Jessup University, but they're live streamed, so you can always join us via Zoom, and they're always recorded. So you get all the access there. Love to have you be a part of what we're doing here at the Center for Bible Study. Thanks for your consideration. Also, if you've been watching our YouTube channel or listening to our podcast, please do subscribe or follow us. That really helps us out. And anything you can do, if you appreciate what we're doing, please do share our content. We want to get the word out that this is here is a resource for people, that it can reach the ears and the eyes that it needs to. That would really be awesome. So that's a way you can always help us out, just by watching our stuff, listening to our stuff, sharing our stuff. That's really, really helpful. We appreciate it. And with that, let's go ahead and jump into our conversation with Dr. Jen Rosner. Well, welcome everybody back to the podcast. I am super excited to have on Dr. Jen Rosner today. We are going to be discussing a number of wonderful things, but Jen, it's so nice to have you on.
Thank you. It's so nice to be here, Max.
Yeah, and we got connected just recently, actually, through the podcast, which was really, really fun. You were kind enough to reach out to me and start up a conversation, and it's just been really fun to get to know you. And I'm so thrilled we can have you on now. So, just for our audience to get a chance to get to know you a little bit, would you mind describing a little bit of your faith journey? What drew you to study of theology? I should say you are the first systematic theologian I have had on the podcast, and this is not something I typically do. You know, us biblical scholars and theologians, we don't always talk to each other. So
I know we're like building a bridge right here, Max. Like we need more of the bridges, you know, like I'm sort of anti-siloization of the academy. So thank you. I'm so honored to be the first systematic theologian. Great question. So I was raised in a Jewish home in Lake Tahoe, California. Both of my parents are Jewish. They were both raised in Los Angeles. My mom was raised in the Reform Jewish movement. My dad was raised in the conservative Jewish movement. They got married and moved to Lake Tahoe. My brother and I were born in Lake Tahoe. And their sort of spiritual journeys, you know, in obvious ways, like all of us, informed my own. My dad was raised finding Judaism to be rather shallow and hypocritical. That was his experience of kind of LA cultural Judaism. And as a teenager, my dad was really searching for spiritual meaning and truth and purpose. And he sort of took different directions with that and ended up having this kind of very strong, what I would consider like non-contextual monotheism. Like for him, it wasn't necessarily connected to Judaism, but it was like this very strong faith in God. And if anything, I think he was trying to sort of offload some of the like pomp and circumstance of Judaism that didn't mean much to him. So from my dad's side, my brother and I were raised with this strong belief in God, prayer life, sort of a general sense of theological truth that God sort of wanted us to live good lives, and like there was some morality in there and some sense of God being present with us, but not within any particularly defined religious context. And my mom loved all things Jewish, and I think she really missed their lives in LA, where there was, you know, she was like the Jewish camp counselor and her family celebrated all the holidays, like not super religious, but more also from a cultural perspective. And so they turned up in Lake Tahoe. They were supposed to be here for a year. They're still in Lake Tahoe, like, you know, 40 some years later. And I think she really struggled with kind of the dearth of Jewish communal life in Lake Tahoe. And so she really worked hard to preserve Judaism in our home. So we would, you know, have Passover Seders every year, and we would light Hanukkah candles every year. And so there was kind of like the spiritual faith aspect from my dad, the cultural Judaism piece from my mom. And that's how I was raised. I was raised with a sense of my Jewish identity, but it wasn't a defining component of like who I was. So then I went off to college. I went to a large public state school in California, Cal Poly, San Luis Obispo. And it kind of just so happened that all of my friends were Christians. And I'm now a college freshman, and I had never like heard the gospel, like had no idea who this person Jesus was, like didn't know anything about like the Bible really, because we didn't really grow up like reading the Bible. And so my college years, I was a political science major, intending to go on to law school. But there was this sort of side narrative going on, which was me becoming friends with all these Christians, and just kind of like by those friendships, like started going to Campus Crusade, which is now called Cru. And, you know, I started going to church with my friends, literally because like I just didn't like being the only kid in the dorms on a Sunday morning. And like all the people in my dorms were Christians at this like large public state school. And so
what were you thinking at that time going to church? Like, did you feel at all like that was a betrayal? Or was it just like, hey, it doesn't really matter, I'm kind of just exploring this? I know with my family, when they first found out I became a Christian, they weren't like super upset, but they did feel like it was kind of like, why that? Like, could you have like just found yoga or something like that? But why?
Right, totally. It's such a good question, especially when we're talking about like Jewish families and their reactions to like Jesus. It's really interesting because I didn't have any of those like anti-Christian biases. Like I hadn't really experienced like anti-Semitism growing up. So I was just like a total blank slate. And here I was with like all these Christian friends, and I found I found their faith very intriguing and very compelling. A couple of my friends like thought it was a very big deal that I was Jewish. And they're like, oh my gosh, God's chosen people, the 144,000. And I'm like, I have no idea what that means. Like, that makes me feel weird. So I was just like kind of soaking it up. Like, I thought some of the Campus Crusade speakers were really compelling and really inspiring. And so it was kind of this journey for me. And then my last year as an undergraduate, it's sort of this interesting set of circumstances that just led me to a place of belief. Like, all of a sudden I'm like, I think this Jesus guy like is who he said he was. And I think that matters to me and for my life. And it was at that point that my mom was like, no. Like, and I think she went through a bit of like, what did I do wrong? Where did I fail? And I think she had a lot of like, kind of anti-Christian bias, and also this feeling of betrayal, like you're kind of leaving the fold. Whereas my dad, who didn't have the same attachment to Judaism, he told me, he said, you know, I always saw it as my job to give you a spiritual foundation, and I knew that you would build on it, and I didn't know what that would look like. So he was much more open to it. And the pastor of the church that I was attending at the time kind of knew my story, and he gave me a book by Stan Telchin, who's like this Messianic Jewish voice from the 1970s. And the book was called Betrayed, and the subtitle is like, what to do when you're 50 years old and Jewish and successful and your 21-year-old daughter tells you she believes in Jesus, which was like hilariously our story. And my dad read the book and like became a follower of Jesus, like within a year of when I did. And the kind of like parallel story, my brother was at the same college as me, and he was friends with some of the same people I was. And he and I also kind of became believers in Jesus around the same time. So it was crazy, which is not the normal story for Jewish people who become followers of Jesus. A lot of times their parents cut them off. They like mourn them as if they're dead. And so that wasn't my story. My mom was the one who had a harder time with it. Again, long rabbit trails that I won't take the time to go into, but my parents started attending an evangelical church in Lake Tahoe where they lived. And my dad just kind of loved, and still to this day, like loves the church, loves the people there, loves the worship, like just eats it up. And my mom is kind of the one who's like she likes it, but I think she's like the annoying one in the women's Bible studies with like all the questions, and they're like, let's just get to the next page of and she's like, no, but like you used all these big words and we didn't define, like she's an academic, and so she's she always like throws kind of a wrench in the women's Bible study because she just like has so many questions. And then she comes to me, you know, this is like years later, and I'm like, well, Mom, here's like 7 great books on the atonement that might help you with your, you know, and she's like, wait, what, really? Like people debate about this? I'm like, yeah, they've been debating about it for centuries. So
that's great.
So it's a little bit about my family's journey and story.
That's so cool. And how did you make your way into thinking about doing theology, like at an academic level? Was it a straight shot from college, or?
Yeah, it was actually. So already when I was in college, I mentioned that I was a political science major preparing to go to law school. But I was so fascinated by this sort of like religion theology that like all of my electives, I took religion courses. And by the time I graduated college and had become a follower of Jesus, I was like, I don't want to go to law school. Like, I'm hooked. Like, I want to dive more deeply into all of this stuff. And so I took a year off after my undergraduate. I stayed in my college town. I like read through the whole Bible in a year, and I like read every single book I could get my hands on. And then I started my MDiv at Yale Divinity School. And I was just like a kid in a candy shop. Like, I just ate it up, like biblical languages and systematic theology and church history. Like, I just loved it without any real sense of like what on earth I was going to do with my degree. But it just sort of one thing led to the next. And after 3 years in Connecticut, I kind of wanted to be back in California. And some friends had told me about this place called Fuller Theological Seminary. And I wasn't married and I didn't have a career track. And so I thought, well, I'll just get a PhD. And so,
as one does, right?
Right. Kind of like PhD by default, you know? So I finished up at Yale. I moved back to California. I started my PhD at Fuller Seminary. And I had kind of fallen in love with Karl Barth, who's like the main person that we talk about in systematic theology classes at Yale. And
I was at St. Andrews, by the way, and they like the Torrances, and we had at one. John Webster tragically passed away while I was there, but while I was there, Alan Torrance and John Webster were both there. So you can imagine the theology seminars were like Barth Central.
Totally. Yeah. Like we do Barth. That's what we did. And I loved it. Like I hated Barth for the first 6 months, and then something snapped into place and I just loved him. So I came to Fuller thinking that I was going to write on Karl Barth's political theology, like this perfect synthesis between my love for Karl Barth and my political science undergraduate. And that was not so. So the first, like my first month in Pasadena at Fuller, I had a meeting with my advisor, who is a wonderful Barth scholar and human being. And I told him that I was Jewish. And he was like, I think I probably just said it in passing. And he was like, wait, what? Like, Jen, that really matters. Like, that really matters in how you approach like Christian systematic theology. Like, your identity matters. And so it was kind of one of these aha moments for me. And I have to say, it was actually during my last year at Yale, through an interesting set of circumstances related to my cousin, who was undergoing conversion to Orthodox Judaism in New York City when I was in Connecticut.
Oh, okay.
And I started having conversations with her, and I started having this little inkling that I had left something really important behind, and that I couldn't any longer just kind of shelve my Jewish identity in the way that I did when I became a follower of Jesus. Because, you know, when I was an undergraduate, I didn't have any Jewish friends. I didn't even know that there was such a thing as like Jewish followers of Jesus or like Messianic Judaism. And so I became a follower of Jesus. I was like all in, wanted to study theology, like kind of just put the Jewish identity piece on the shelf. Mm-hmm. And so it was my last year at Yale that there started to be some like, wait, like maybe that's important in terms of my identity and my perspective and my worldview. And so I landed at Fuller with this advisor who's like really encouraging me to delve into those questions. He introduced me to a man named Mark Kinzer, who is like the world's leading Messianic Jewish theologian. Mark Kinzer ended up working with me really closely during my doctoral program. And my doctoral program ended up being this opportunity for me to, in like a really structured way, just sort of like wrestle through all of these identity questions that I was struggling with about my own like Judaism and faith in Jesus and like this complex history between these two religious traditions. And so my dissertation, which was then published as my first book, is called Healing the Schism, Karl Barth, Franz Rosenzweig, and the New Jewish Christian Encounter. So I ended up writing about sort of, and maybe we'll talk about this a little bit later, this really fascinating era of Jewish-Christian relations and dialogue that we find ourselves in post-Holocaust. And it was just very cathartic for me to spend, you know, however many years like in the library, like reading and researching about like post-Holocaust Jewish theology and like post-Holocaust Christian theology and just kind of like getting deeper and deeper into these identity questions that became and have been ever since, like also my vocational professional trajectory. Yeah,
that's so cool. Yeah, I when I was in Germany, I did a little bit of editing for one of the professors there. He was the chair of Jewish studies, which is so funny. In Germany, the chair of Jewish studies is embedded in the Department of Protestant Theology. So go figure. But that's the German system. But he was writing about Franz Rosenzweig, and I just read a little bit of his stuff because he was having me, native English speaker, look at his English. And I was like, man, looks really interesting. I wish I had more time to like delve into some of these figures, because he was really focused on some of these key modern Jewish thinkers post-Holocaust and just, obviously the history in Germany is what it is. So anyway, so I'd love to talk first. I want to get into your academic work for sure, but I'd love to first just talk a little bit about Messianic Judaism in general, kind of as a concept. You know, you mentioned in passing the reaction that a couple of your friends had when they found out you were Jewish, your Christian friends, like, ooh, one of God's chosen people, and, you know, all this kind of stuff. And I had a very similar experience when we first came into this evangelical church. Like, they were really making a big deal about the fact that I was Jewish, but in a very weird way. And I was like, I don't know what this is, but this is weird. And then I remember we had like a Passover Seder, but it like was not like any of the Passover Seders I ever had. It was kind of interesting, but it was just like, what is the fascination? I couldn't fit it together. And then, and so I kind of left that off to the side. And then when I became an academic and all my interest started becoming ancient Judaism, Christianity, then I was like, oh, I kind of get this, but now like from a different angle. But now I'm kind of in a place where I'm like, okay, we have Messianic Judaism today. What exactly is it? And is it one thing or are there multiple expressions of it? Like,
Yeah.
I'd love to hear you kind of unpack this for us, because I think we've all, like, people have encountered different kinds of Messianic Judaism, but it's not maybe necessarily one thing today either.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. And if it's all right, I'd like to go a little bit farther back because I think it provides some helpful context. So, I mean, we know that Jesus was Jewish, like his followers were Jewish. It's not really until the book of Acts that we see this, Gentile inclusion, this Gentile mission, and then especially in the letters of Paul. And then if we sort of track through the early centuries after, after the coming of Jesus, you end up getting these really complex hostilities between the what's now the majority Gentile Christian church and the mainstream Judaism, which becomes Rabbinic Judaism in the aftermath of the destruction of the Second Temple. And these communities end up defining themselves in mutual exclusion from one another, which is really the reality that we see today, right? There's Judaism, there's Christianity, and most people think they don't have a lot to do with one another. And what gets kind of stamped out in that process is this reality of Jewish followers of Jesus, which was like very much the norm in the Gospels, like in the New Testament that we read. And so that is, this reality, for the most part, in any kind of organized, visible way, like disappears for maybe 1700 years. And then you start to see in the 18th, 19th centuries, these interesting kind of pioneering figures who are let's say Orthodox Jewish rabbis who have this kind of secret faith in Jesus. So you start to see these front runners of people who are trying to kind of hold on to both identities. And that really becomes a movement in the 1970s. So you have all of the hippies becoming Christians on beach, where all of those movements are birthed. But then some of the hippies were Jewish and they end up going on to found what becomes the modern Messianic Jewish movement. And it's a complex movement, as one would expect if you're trying to kind of not necessarily wind back the clock, but maybe discover a reality that hasn't existed for what do we do with Christian tradition and practice, which has been developed without any conversation? They've mostly just developed in mutual exclusion from one another. And so Messianic Judaism is this tradition that's trying to find a way for Jews to live authentically as Jews and followers of Jesus. But it's kind of a messy movement. The whole movement is kind of one big identity crisis because we're trying to just figure this out. And so you have kind of a spectrum. You have one end of the spectrum in Messianic Judaism feels a lot like Christianity with sort of some Jewish trappings, maybe there's congregations, Messianic Jewish congregations. So of course, then you get the Messianic Jewish congregational movement. You have some that meet on Sundays, feels a lot like a church. Maybe they say a couple Hebrew blessings. And then all the way at the other end of the spectrum, you have very, very Jewish, Messianic Jewish congregations. And I would say that's the end of the spectrum where there's a great deal of rigorous theological work being done. Mark Kinzer would sort of fall on that end of the spectrum, taking Jewish tradition very, very seriously, as opposed to Rabbinic Judaism developed in, this consistent posture of rejecting Jesus. And so it's not authoritative and it doesn't really matter for us. And it's this sort of aberration. So it's quite a spectrum, the Messianic Jewish movement. And then, of course, as you sort of alluded to, you have all kinds of Gentile Christians who are just sort of fascinated. They read their New Testaments and they think that there's something significant about the Jewish people. And so they're wait, Messianic Judaism, we want in on that. We want to learn about the things that Jesus did and we want to do Passover Seders. And so then you get an even followers of Jesus, trying to figure out how to follow Jesus as a Jew. And then you have all these Gentiles who, for different reasons, are really drawn to this movement. So, if one of your listeners is to walk into a Messianic Jewish congregation, they might be shocked to find that it's like 80% Gentiles there. Like, where's the Jews in the Messianic Jewish congregation?
Yeah,
so,
right. It's interesting.
It's a very complex movement. It's also very new, and it's kind of just figuring itself out, really.
Yeah. To what extent would you say is dispensational theology tied to Messianic Judaism? Because I think I had a guy on, Dan Hummel. He's an American historian, so he was on the podcast. People can check it out. But he wrote a book on kind of the rise and fall of dispensational theology, and where that becomes pertinent for the Messianic Jewish conversation is that dispensational theology, personally, I think it's a little wacky, but it does create a space for Israel, albeit in a kind of weird way. But what that does is it I think it created kind of almost like a theological space for Messianic Judaism making sense to some Christians. Yeah, so whatever you would want to do with that, but what do you think about the relationship between dispensational theology? So the idea that all the Israel stuff has kind of been deferred, but Israel as a whole is still God's people, and and Messianic Judaism.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the emergence of all of these different sort of threads, dispensational theology, Messianic Judaism, they're sort of intertwined in that you have, at the same set of questions that people are approaching from different lenses, the same exegetical questions, the same questions about realities going on in our world, historical developments, historical events. And so I think they're definitely related in terms of like overall context. And I think dispensational theology has probably had a much stronger influence in that kind of Christian end of the spectrum in Messianic Judaism. So if we map the spectrum between I would say less so in the wing of Messianic Judaism that takes Judaism very seriously and that sees some of the inconsistencies within dispensational theology. So I think it's a great question. I don't know that there's a simple, straightforward answer except to say that the threads are intertwined somehow, and we would have to sort of like zoom in on particular iterations of Messianic Jewish theology or particular figures within Messianic Judaism to see exactly how those thought patterns are intersecting or not intersecting. I think when you get someone like Mark Kinzer, again, kind of leading Messianic Jewish theologian, I think he's doing what I would consider to be much more interesting things in terms of eschatological realities and the enduring significance of God's covenant with the people of Israel. But yeah, I think dispensational theology is certainly in this kind of mix that we're talking about.
Well, I think it's helpful. The way you said it, something clicked for me that the people that maybe are kind of really seriously thinking about Messianic Judaism are kind of in one camp, and the other one that's kind of more likely to incorporate bits of Judaism and like on the other side, that seems to be the one that's more likely to intersect with dispensationalism.
Yes.
And where that also clicks for me is I always look at people's bookshelves when I go and visit their houses. It's just my nature. And I tend to, in a lot of Christian homes when I visit, I'll see books by Messianic Jewish rabbis, and I suspect that those are the kind of books that fall into that camp, the dispensational camp. But it makes sense if that's the camp that is kind of most overlapping with streams of evangelicalism that have been influenced by dispensational theology. So that was helpful for me. That just sort of clicked in my mind when you were saying that. Yeah, that's good.
I think that's right.
So, all right. So in Healing the Schism, right? So this is a book that came out of your doctoral dissertation. You're tracing this kind of long history of Jewish-Christian dialogue from antiquity all the way into the present. Could you give us maybe just kind of a broad outline of what that dialogue looked like? Maybe like what were some of the central tenets or themes that kind of come out of that? So I'd love to hear just kind of your bird's eye view of what that dialogue has looked like for the past 2,000 years. But I'd also then like to hear about, like, where do you hope that the dialogue goes in the future?
Yeah. I mean, we talked a little bit earlier about, the way that Jesus is Jewish, his followers are Jewish, but in the early centuries after the coming of Messiah, you get this tension, this growing tension between the, increasingly Gentile Christian community and the, sort of proto-rabbinic or rabbinic community. And these communities end up defining themselves in mutual exclusion from one another. And one of the things that we see very early in Christian tradition is the presence of Christian anti-Judaism, right? So we can look at some of the church fathers, people like Justin Martyr or Ignatius of Antioch, and we can just read these scathing things about the Jewish people and God's covenant with Israel and the blindness of Israel and how it's impossible to follow Jesus and practice Judaism. So we really see, and some people want to trace this back to the New Testament. Now, I would push really hard against that. I think this is like something that develops within this realm of patristic theology, and then kind of has this continuous thread through medieval theology, through the Reformation. Like we could talk about Martin Luther, the major anti-Semite that people don't often talk about, the shadow side of Martin Luther. And so this kind of seed of Christian anti-Judaism develops into what we academics call supersessionism, right? The idea that the Christian church, God's covenant with Christians through Jesus, has somehow, and there's different ways that it gets configured, replaced God's covenant with the people of Israel. So kind of like out with the old, in with the new, and you get all these really strong tropes, like Judaism's all about law, Christianity's all about grace, faith versus works. You get this perfectly neat juxtaposition between Judaism and Christianity, God's covenant with Israel, God's new covenant with, the Christian church. And those themes are very strong throughout the history of Christian theology, beginning, as I said, in the patristic era. And this sort of tidal wave of Christian anti-Semitism, Christian anti-Judaism, Christian supersessionism just sort of builds and builds and builds. And Christians, probably especially in Germany, although elsewhere as well, are just kind of lulled into this particular perspective, even if a bit unwittingly, such that like very few Christians actually stand up against Hitler and what's going on. I mean, the Catholic Church like makes an accord with the Nazis. And so you get this really complex, tragic series of events that happens in the 20th century. So we have the Holocaust, and immediately following the founding of the modern state of Israel, you have the emergence of Messianic Judaism in the 1970s, right? As we mentioned before, you have this entirely new, and this is like where I'm treading upon your territory, chapter in New Testament studies, right? Where it becomes about, the quest for the historical Jesus and, pressing more into the Jewishness of Jesus, the Jewishness of Paul. I mean, we see this developing daily before our eyes. If you, look at New Testament books that are being published, probably yours included. And you also have this interesting fundamental Christian missiological shift, whereby Christian mission no longer looks like colonization, right? You have this sort of post-colonial view of Christian mission, whereby the goal is not for, white Western Christians to go to these, primal cultures and make people, export Christianity, commerce, and culture, right? Like the 3 C's of Christian mission. So you start to get this whole new wave in Christian missiology where it's like, no, like we need to, facilitate Chinese Christians and African Christians, like finding these unique expressions of the Christian gospel rather than exporting Western culture alongside with, all these colonial endeavors to these, sort of Eastern, Southern countries. And so you have all of these things that kind of come together and cause very interesting new avenues of thought and reflection in the Christian community as well as in the Jewish community. So you have Christians for the first time, particularly in the aftermath of the Holocaust. We kind of stood by while this happened. How is it that were lulled into complacency with, Hitler who completely twists Christian theology and puts out something entirely different that people kind of don't, it's like a bait and switch that wasn't caught, It causes a crisis, I would say, within the Christian theological world, as well as obviously in the Jewish world.
Yeah.
And so you start to have what I call in my book, Healing the Schism, the new Jewish-Christian encounter. So you begin to have this sort of post-Holocaust. And I track Karl Barth on the Christian side and Franz Rosenzweig on the Jewish side as kind of front runners of this new relationship that we see developing between Judaism and Christianity post-Holocaust, whereby Christians are sort of looking anew at Judaism, and the sort of scales are falling off their eyes about these really destructive tropes like the works versus grace and the faith versus law and the Judaism versus Christianity and the Old Covenant, New Covenant, like all of these really problematic pillars that Christian theology has been built on for centuries. And I mean, you see this with the Second Vatican Council in the early 1960s, where the Catholic Church issues this document called Nostra Aetate in Our Times, where the Catholic Church is basically taking really important steps towards repudiating Christian supersessionism. Like, we got it wrong. And the document denounces any form of Christian anti-Semitism. So that's a really key moment in terms of Christians. And then Protestant churches tend to follow suit. So now lots and lots of Protestant denominations have sort of statements about Jews and Judaism. And so we're living in this really interesting, I would say exciting, redemptive time where Christians are beginning to have their eyes open to and increasingly work to renounce these really dark threads of Christian theology. And then you have Jewish thinkers who are now starting to be a little bit more open to talking about Christianity and thinking maybe maybe Christianity isn't the essence of the problem, and maybe not all Christians are anti-Semitic. So you have this interesting sort of reappraisal going on between the Jewish and Christian communities that I find very hopeful on a number of levels. So just briefly to get to your question of where would I hope that this would go, I think because the narrative of the parting of the ways, whereby, Judaism is this entirely separate thing from Christianity, because I think that that's so problematic and so inaccurate if we read the New Testament.
Yeah, in fact, there was a collection of essays called "The Parting of the Ways," which, but it was very much looking at like Jewish-Christian relations. And then there was a book that came out recently called, "The Ways That Never Parted" is the book that I'm thinking of. And the point is that there's always been these ongoing interactions. And then another book came out recently, which I like the title, and it wasn't polemical against the ways that never parted, but it was the ways that often parted. And the point there in the title is to say, yes, it's rather than thinking of it like this, two sides just going their separate ways, what we have is these ongoing, constant converges, sometimes in mutually enriching ways, sometimes antagonistically, or maybe oftentimes, but it's complicated, but it's not like the relationship wasn't there. It was happening. It was going on. I was amazed when I first found out Jerome was studying Hebrew with rabbis when he was working on the Vulgate translation. So it's just all kinds of, and then like, why is it that you have church fathers in the 3rd, 4th, 5th century telling Christians, hey, don't celebrate Yom Kippur or don't do X, Y, or Z? It's like, because they're doing it. So yeah, it's more complicated. Yeah.
Yes, it's very complicated. I mean, even that term, the parting of the ways, it's sort of an inaccurate term because it makes it sound like, oh, they parted and then that was that. But as you're saying, that's such helpful context that it's so much more complex than that, right? And these communities that like supposedly parted continue to define themselves over against one another, right? So this is sort of why, like, as we alluded to earlier with like our parents or our families, like believing in Jesus is like the one thing you can't do as a Jew. Like you can be like a Boo Jew, like a Buddhist Jew, but you have this really strong aversion to, and I mean, there's such this long history, right, of these traditions kind of warring against each other. And there's, these wonderful scholars that write about the way in which they never totally parted. They, it's almost like, in psychology, the more like distance that you need from someone, actually probably like you've actually not worked through your issues with that person if you need to like cut them off or whatever.
Yeah.
So because of that history, I just find it so troubling. And, we see this, for example, the Council of Nicaea, which takes place in 325, convened by Constantine, this like Christian emperor of the Roman Empire. And that's the point at which we have the definitive separation between Passover and Easter, such that now, like, it's just a calendrical accident if the two happen to overlap. But that kind of decoupling is really theologically problematic if we're trying to understand like what the resurrection of Jesus is all about. You also have in the 4th century this intentional, and this is again thanks to Constantine, this intentional separation between Sunday worship and Saturday worship. Jews worship on Saturdays, always have. That's the Sabbath. Christians worship on Sundays, and there is New Testament precedent for that, right? Christian followers of Jesus begin gathering on the day that Jesus ascended, which is Sunday, but it becomes this kind of political statement to drive a wedge between the days on which these two communities worship. And so all of that history, it just like deeply pains me. I think because as a Messianic Jew, as someone who self-identifies as a Messianic Jew, Jewish believer in Jesus, like it feels like it's trying to sort of rend apart these two fundamental pieces of myself. And this is what I mentioned. My doctoral program was deeply personal. Like these are all the questions that I am wrestling with and that we see so deeply embedded in church history. A friend of mine once said, you know, asking me to choose between Jesus and Judaism is like asking me to choose between my heart and my lungs. Like it's just this really powerful, vivid imagery of how one of the things that becomes impossible is following Jesus as a Jew. And so I do think that, I think all of what we see happening in the latter half of the 20th century, beginning of the 21st century is very hopeful in that I think we're getting towards maybe a more truthful understanding of these two communities rather than this kind of like knee-jerk reaction, totally separate, like tropes, dichotomies, like totally separate. And I think you see scholars, and these are a lot of the scholars who I deal with in Healing the Schism, who are just answering, or who are asking really honest questions without the layers of kind of bias that very understandably have been there for both communities, perhaps especially the Jewish community. And I think that we're kind of opening new vistas of kind of understanding key concepts. There's some really incredible books out there. There's a book that came out about 20 years ago called Christianity in Jewish Terms. And it's like this whole collection of like Jewish scholars and Christian scholars, and they're like writing essays on like, what does atonement mean in Judaism? And like, what does atonement mean in Christianity? And it's like you could take any of these concepts. And I remember when I was in college and I went to a church that my friend was the pastor of, and he preached a whole series on election. Like, and this was a Presbyterian church, I should say. And I was like psyched, like I want to learn about the history of election. And never once did he mention the election of Israel. Like as if you could talk about the concept of Christian election without talking about the election of Israel. But this is just how Christian categories have been forever and ever. Like what does Israel have to do with the concept of election? Like we talk about tulip here, you know, like, the 5-point Calvinism. So anyway, I think that we're kind of peeling back some of those biases and this embedded framework of these two religious traditions being mutually exclusive. And I think that that's very hopeful. It's recasting the way that New Testament studies, I think that's very much in the same vein, like this whole Paul within Judaism camp. Like, wait a second, maybe Paul didn't have a radical break with Judaism when he had his Damascus Road experience. So I think it's just very hopeful. And I do think that we're seeing really interesting signs. There's a book coming out next year that's written by these sort of Paul within Judaism scholars that has an essay by Messianic Jews in it, myself included. Like, so you're starting to see these inclusions. Like Messianic Judaism is no longer just this kind of like syncretistic like aberration that like is kind of the worst of both worlds. Like you're starting to see, wait a second, maybe there is actually a voice for those who claim both traditions. So that's just a little bit of what I find to be very hopeful about this current season that we find ourselves in.
That's awesome. Yeah, that's really cool. It's kind of weird. I was thinking as you were talking, it's funny that in the New Testament, they're trying to answer the question, can you be a Gentile and a follower of Jesus? Right. And now we're trying to unravel the question, to what extent can you be a Jew and a follower of Jesus?
Totally.
And that is so ironic to see how much those things have flipped.
Completely flipped. And I think that most Christians, for example, when we read the book of Acts, like just don't quite catch how scandalous it was for these Gentile Christians to like be now following the God of Israel through the person of Messiah without becoming Jewish. Like that was the scandal. And now, exactly as you said, the scandal like ever since has been continuing to claim Judaism as a follower of Jesus. So absolutely remarkable flip there.
Yeah, and also, you know, what you highlighted a couple points in church history where power dynamics shift and change, and I think that's always important for people to take into consideration. You know, reading someone like a Justin Martyr's dialogue with Trypho, that can be kind of painful at times. You know, especially when he's reading texts about promises made to the children of Abraham, and he looks at Trypho. It's like an Isaiah text, and he says, that can't be talking about you. He's talking about us, right? And it's this competition over who's the people of God, identity formation, wrestling, probably what's going on with John's kind of idiosyncratic use of the Jews in the Gospel of John, or Judaioi, however you want to translate that, Jews or Judeans. But once those power dynamics get so entrenched, and you have one group now that has like the dominant cultural power, everything kind of shifts and takes on a new life of its own. Not saying the other stuff is great, but it's easier to understand when you have like minority emerging groups trying to figure out their own identity vis-a-vis others. But yeah, it's so I appreciate you highlighting, you know, kind of that shift. Yeah, but ultimately I agree. I think it is a really hopeful time, and I'm always excited when I'm at Bible conferences and we have Jewish and Christian scholars sitting alongside one another, studying Hebrew Bible together, studying the New Testament together. That's been a really cool, you know, development, I think. So, yeah.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, I mean, like, it really impacts how we understand the New Testament. Like, there's really deep implications here. You know, for example, the Gospel of John, like, it is so, the Gospel of John has so often been kind of co-opted as this, like, very anti-Semitic text. And it makes such a difference, as you said, just to sort of highlight again, like, if you have what you actually have in this sort of world of Second Temple Judaism, which is these sort of different factions, different sects of Jews, all kind of arguing against each other. And if you read rabbinic literature, like pretty intense arguments that are going on between these different rabbis, that is so different to understand about Judaism versus this later importation of meaning where it's Christians versus Jews, right? It's those Jews who don't get it as opposed to all these Gentile Christians who do get it, which is like, I don't think it's an accurate reading of, but it just goes to show how these texts get kind of twisted, and that twisting very quickly becomes violent, right? It very quickly leads massacres and disputations, like this terrible dark history that in many ways hinges upon our understanding of New Testament texts. And I think this is why it's so exciting to me that we're seeing so many strides being made. My colleague David Rudolph is kind of heading up this whole like post-supersessionist New Testament commentary set that's just fascinating.
That's really cool. I've read some of his work. Yeah, he's great. Yeah, that's really cool.
Like peeling back the layers of like, gosh, how has supersessionist Christian theology impacted our understanding of Paul or our understanding of the book of Revelation or the Gospel of John? Like there's such weighty questions there, and it just makes such a difference in terms of how we understand key theological concepts and how that plays out in terms of communal life, like very practically, actually.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, no, that's so well said. Yeah, it makes all the difference in the world too. If you're imagining John's audience, the audience of John's Gospel, some of them were Judaioi, like they were. So it's like there's something going on there. More, it's just more than absolutely. We've kind of been already getting at this, but I'd like to maybe unpack it a little bit more, give you a chance to give maybe some examples that you find helpful that you give in your book, Finding Messiah, which is a kind of an introduction to, hey, the Jewishness of Jesus and what it means to really see Jesus fully as a first century Jewish man, what that means for the Christian faith. So what are some, for you, some really key points that you bring out in the book and that you would want others to know, which I encourage everybody, by the way, get this book. It's a good, get the book and read it.
Thank you. Finding Messiah, which came out in 2022, was my first non-academic book. It was my first trade book, because part of what I want to do is not just be speaking in this kind of echo chamber that academia can be. Like I really want to help, Christians in pews, number one, be exposed to these conversations that academics have, at conferences and in classrooms all the time, but also sort of wrestle with and in some sense be troubled by some of these questions. And, the subtitle of Finding Messiah is A Journey into the Jewishness of the Gospel. And one of the things that's remarkable to me is how often in Christian churches, the Christian gospel gets preached without any mention of God's covenant with the people of Israel. When I heard, in college, 4 spiritual laws or these different ways that the gospel gets preached, no mention.
We were created, we sinned, Jesus jumped out of heaven on a cross, problem solved.
Right, exactly. Now say the prayer, Max, right?
Yeah.
That's the gospel. Creation, fall, redemption, new creation. That's all you need to know. And if that's the case, pretty much the entire Tanakh or Old Testament from Genesis 3, the fall, up until Matthew 1, where Jesus comes, it doesn't matter. If anything, it's this extended example of the problem. Oh, look, there's Israel, faltering and failing. That's why we needed Jesus. You get these really problematic biblical hermeneutics when you preach a gospel that has nothing to do with God's covenant with the people of Israel. And so my hope and my goal in Finding Messiah is to, again, bring some of these questions onto the radar screen of just everyday Christians who aren't necessarily seminarians or academics. And so the book does, each chapter covers a different topic, and a lot of it is some of the things we've already talked about, like Christian supersessionism, how we understand Paul, the significance of the land. Does the land matter? Because you have Christians all over the spectrum on that one. But if you look at Jewish tradition and literature and liturgy, the land is actually really significant. And that, of course, becomes much more complicated in the 20th century with the modern state of Israel and all of these questions about contemporary Zionism. But trying to offer a little snippet of these topics in hopefully a bite-sized way that's also interwoven with my own story. So this book is kind of half memoir and half biblical theological reflection. Talking about things like sin and obedience and the way in which those categories tend to get construed in Christian tradition versus Jewish tradition. The book also is trying to take a pretty hefty swing at dualism, this notion that gets very early on embedded within Christian theology that has to do with our theology of bodies. And it's straight up imported from Greek philosophy and Plato, right? Where our bodies are the problem and the true goal of the spiritual life is to be free of these bodies and to float around as spiritual beings with God forever and ever. Amen. These interesting Christian theological categories that just kind of fly in the face, number one, of ongoing Jewish tradition, which has a much higher theology of the body. Our bodies matter and they will matter. So this notion of dualism whereby you have the spirit, which is good, and the body, which is fallen and bad and fleshly. There's a lot in the book about that and the way in which dualism has kind of influenced Christian theology and our vision of heaven and the afterlife and those kinds of things. So again, a lot of the topics that we've been talking about, trying to just get a wider audience for these kinds of conversations and these kinds of tensions, such that it's no longer okay that we preach the gospel without reference to God's covenant with Israel, such that it's no longer okay that oh yeah, Jesus was Jewish, but that doesn't really matter, and there's been all kinds of interesting scholarship in the last 50, 75 years about the Jewishness of Jesus actually means that he was black because it's all about who's oppressed and, these interesting things.
Yeah. Right. Absolutely.
And I just want to, if I can just say one more thing, and then I'm sure we'll keep talking, but I also want to make it very clear what I'm not saying in Finding Messiah. What I'm not saying is that Christians need to live as Jews. Christians, in order to understand and deeply, press into the Jewishness of Jesus, the Jewishness of the gospel, the Jewishness of the New Testament, need to forsake Sunday worship and start worshiping on Saturdays, or need to forsake Christian holidays and start practicing Jewish holidays. That's actually not what I'm saying in the book, because I think it's very important. And this is little bit of foreshadowing to my next book, which I'm beginning to write, which is that that God created Jews and Gentiles, Israel and the nations, in the same way. I mean, Paul puts this up against the way that we have male and female, right? Like, these are really fundamental distinctions in creation that only make sense united to one another. So what I'm not saying is that, like, and again, this is also, I think, what Paul was not saying, like, there's no advantage in being Jewish. As followers of Jesus, like, we need Jews and we need Gentiles, and the beauty is that now, rather than having Israel and the nations warring against each other, as we so often see throughout the Old Testament, you have Israel and the nations together worshiping the one true God. Like, that's the beauty of the gospel. And what that means is that Gentile Christians, non-Jews, like, really need to wrestle with how to authentically be Gentile Christians, because we need this synthesis between, synthesis is probably not the right word. We need this coupling of Jews and Gentiles in the body of Messiah. And that's part of the power of the gospel, is this overcoming of hostility between Jews and Gentiles. So I just want to get that out there, because I think it's a way that the book can be misunderstood, is saying, now we all need to live as Jews, which I don't think is actually the answer.
Yeah, no, totally agree. And I have seen people go that route when they get kind of struck with the Jewishness of Jesus as a Gentile, which, hey, that helps you see why this was such an issue early on, and why Paul's having to tell Gentiles, slow down, like, you don't need to circumcise, you don't need, you know, so yeah, very good, very good.
And I think it's why it's so important to understand the context of Paul's letters. So people read Paul's letters and they're like, see, he hates the Torah. And you're like, no, he's just discouraging Gentile Christians from feeling like they have to be Jews. Like, you know, Acts 15, Jerusalem Council, like, very clearly indicates, like, Gentile followers of Jesus do not have to become Jews. Paul is reinforcing that. But if we take that out of context, it seems like Paul's done with Torah. So I think it's really, it matters a lot how we understand these texts and who they're written to and what's going on in the language that Paul, for example, uses.
Absolutely, absolutely. I've had students ask me this question from time to time in class, especially when they find out that I'm Jewish. What do Jews believe about the Messiah today? Like, and it's always like, give them an academic answer, like, well, it's complicated. Like, they're different. Different Jews believe. It's always like, I always tell them, it's like, well, what do Christians believe about X, Y, or Z today? Like, give me one answer. But it's funny, as Christians, we think other religions somehow are just like monolithic, and that we have all our different, beliefs. But, when we think about like the way that Messianism develops into the medieval period, even different Messianic ideas are floating around. Like, so like thinking about the Messiah today from a Jewish perspective, what would you say to an audience, say students, if they asked you that question, like, what do Jews believe about the Messiah today? One made a really good connection. They said, so for the Jews that are waiting for the Messiah, it's kind of like waiting for the return of Jesus. And I was like, yeah, you got it. That's it's kind of like that. Yeah. So
it is. And it kind of can seem like a cop-out to be like, well, that's really complicated, and there's lots of different viewpoints on that. But it's actually true, like there's this saying, 2 Jews, 3 opinions, and it's very true, like in terms of Jewish theology as well. Like there's lots of different Jewish views.
But you know what I love so much about that, though, and I didn't appreciate that till I started reading more ancient Jewish literature, is you can have all these opinions and arguments, and yet they're still part of the same people.
Yes.
Like don't you love it that all this literature sets all these debates side by side, and half the time it doesn't even tell you who's right. It's just like so-and-so says this and that and this, and they argued, and then whatever, I don't know. It's, there's something about that I really love, and I really wish more Christians could learn from that, because it's like you need your interlocutors to sharpen you. Like even though the Sadducees are often wrong, they play a role like in the conversation and getting to anyway. So
yes, and this is why my mom came to the Christian Bible study with like all the questions and wanting to argue and like, what if Jesus is wrong? Or, exactly. And the Christians are like, we can't do that. It's like the holy word of God. Like this is how Jews roll. Like we debate, we argue. That's how it goes, and that's how it's always gone. Like, again, if we read rabbinic literature, it's Jews arguing with Jews. Like, and I think we have to understand the New Testament in some sense in that vein. You know, we were talking earlier about the Gospel of John. So I think, you know, coming back to the messianism question, it's a messy question, right? There's lots of these different viewpoints on it, Jewish messianic expectations. And I would probably highlight a few things in answering that question. Number one, you know, from a certain perspective, Jesus failed, right? Like, he was crucified on a Roman cross. Like, he did not usher in, like, what we see portraits of new creation in the book of Isaiah, for example. Like, and I think this kind of dovetails with what we were talking about earlier with the issue of dualism. Like, Christians, especially Christians who are pretty comfortable with, like, body-soul dualism, like, our bodies don't really matter and, like, we're just hanging on till we, like, get to heaven kind of thing. Like, it's no problem that Jesus, like, oh, he was just talking about a spiritual kingdom the whole time. Like, of course he wasn't talking about, like, overthrowing the Roman Empire. How crazy would that be? And I think for Jews, like, that's a bit of a crisis, because for Jews, redemption is physical and tangible and material, and new creation is just that. It's like a redeemed version of creation. So there is actually, and I think, you know, of course there's very legitimate and truthful theological answers to this conundrum, but I think to just sort of pose that as a bit of a problem, right? Like, this is why many Jews put Jesus in a long line of, like, failed messiahs, like someone who claimed that they were the Messiah and then failed in their mission to bring about the Messianic age. And I think that problem becomes further exacerbated as you increasingly have this kind of parting of the ways and Jesus getting preached over against Judaism, right? Like, Jesus has in the way that the gospel often gets preached, Jesus has nothing to do with Judaism. He has nothing to do with God's ongoing relationship with the people of Israel and God's covenant with the people of Israel. And so the Jesus who has gotten preached, particularly to the Jewish people over the centuries, or just in general, like, he's like, look at European art, right? He's like Brad Pitt. Like, this is not a first century Middle Eastern man that we're preaching. Like, this is like the European colonial gospel. So I think that's very muddy. And I think more in contemporary Judaism, I mean, you still have, like, sects of Jews who are, like, waiting for the Messiah and, like, preparing to build the third temple and, like, all these things. But you also get these more interesting kind of, like, it's not a person, it's like an era, like the Messianic era, and it's like our job to usher that in. Or, you know, you have sort of like Messianic Zionism that, like, the founding of the modern state of Israel is the dawn of the Messianic age. And that's why, like, every Jew in the world should, like, move to Israel and, like, settle the land. Like, you have Jewish Messianism going in all these different directions. And I think, just last point, I think what's important to say is that as we were talking before about how these two traditions, like, never actually part, even though they, like, pretend to part over and over again, I think a lot of Jewish Messianic expectation is actually developed in such a way that we could never believe that Jesus is the Messiah, right? Like, we sort of problematize Jesus as Messiah because that's what Judaism is doing, right? It's sort of showing that it's not Christianity. And so even someone like Maimonides, who has, like, this sort of structured thought around what the Messiah will be like, it's like, you could almost say, like, yeah, Jesus, it can't ever be Jesus. But of course he's writing much, much later, and he's sort of influenced by this history of mutually exclusive identity formation between these two communities. So I don't think you can ever say, like, what does Judaism believe about the Messiah? We could ask that in, like, the Old Testament, even Second Temple Judaism. But once we get past the New Testament and we have this complex, like, foment between Judaism and Christianity, any Jewish messianism, from my perspective, is going to somehow be developed over against Christian theology. That's just one of the ways that the story's going to go.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. No, it's really interesting. Like, all Christology it's like a strain of messianism. All early Christology is a strain of messianism, and Jewish messianism is in conversation with early Christology as it's, you know, developing, you know. So you get, like, the Messiah, son of Joseph, comes and dies. Well, where did that idea come from?
Right.
I wonder. Right. You know.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. But yeah. So that's cool. Yeah. I was gonna say. Yeah. So what are some good resources for like listeners other than getting your book? Like good resources for our listeners and viewers who want to learn a little bit more about Messianic Judaism, and just maybe this is the first time they've really thought about this is a theological problem. Yeah, what would you? Are there some books or online resources you would suggest?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the name that I mentioned several times is Mark Kinzer. He's sort of like the leading Messianic Jewish theologian. His work tends to be pretty academic. There's one book of his that was then made into sort of like a less academic version. With the less academic version is called Besorah, which is like the Hebrew word for gospel. I would also just say in terms of some of the concepts that we've been talking about, it's not specifically about Messianic Judaism, but there's a Christian scholar named Kendall Solon writing on Christian supersessionism. So if you're kind of like, wait, what? Like, what's that? I don't, then he wrote a book called The God of Israel in Christian Theology. That was his first book, and he's written a lot since then. And sometimes he gets frustrated. Why is everybody stuck on this book I wrote in the 80s? Like, read my stuff I'm reading now. But it's such a good just like diagnosis of Christian
I feel bad.
supersessionism.
That's the book I have of his on my
Me
shelf.
too.
That's the one.
Always, everybody.
It's really good.
No, it's so good. There's nothing better in terms of like diagnosing and understanding Christian supersessionism. And I also think, so Messianic Judaism, my work, Mark Kinzer's work, Kendall Solon's work in terms of Christian supersessionism. I also think a really important part of this conversation is how we understand the New Testament. And so there's, this whole slew of scholars like Max Botner and, Matt Thiessen is a really good scholar. He actually came out with a more kind of introductory level book called A Jewish Paul.
We just had an episode on it.
Oh my gosh, I love it.
Yeah,
love it.
great
Channeling
book,
past episodes. Yes, exactly. Matt Thiessen's work is awesome in this regard. And again, I mentioned before, these are all sort of academic resources, and this is why scholars need to write more trade books so that they're not all academic recommendations.
Right.
It's
Absolutely.
like me and Lauren Winner who write trade. No, there's others as well, but Michelle Van Loon, she's a great scholar who writes trade books, Jewish follower of Jesus. Some of the Paul within Judaism scholarship or the reading the New Testament after supersessionism, just trying to get a handle on how has this really troubled history in ways that we're not even aware of most of the time, colored our understanding of the text. I think those are such important questions that in many ways overlap with the issue of Messianic Judaism, right? Because we've sort of read the text in such a way that God's covenant with the people of Israel is done in one way or another. And if it's not done, then you end up saying, well, what about Jewish followers of Jesus? Are they different? Is there something different for Jewish followers of Jesus than Gentile followers of Jesus? It sort of leads you into these questions about Messianic Judaism more specifically.
Yeah. Would you mind sharing a little bit about Yachad B'Yeshua, just to hear a little bit about the organization and what it's all about?
I would love to. I love talking about Yachad B'Yeshua. So in 2008, Mark Kinzer, Messianic Jewish theologian, bumped into a guy named Father Antoine Levy in Jerusalem. Now, Father Antoine Levy is a French Jewish Dominican Catholic priest, right? So talk about boom.
Combining identities right there.
Yeah, all the things. So he's a Jewish Catholic priest. And he met Mark Kinzer in Jerusalem, and the two of them really developed this very strong relationship. And they developed a vision for creating a conversation for Jewish followers of Jesus from all across the ecclesial spectrum. So you have Messianic Jews kind of doing their thing, and you have Hebrew Catholics doing their thing. But Yachad B'Yeshua is really trying to create a space and a fellowship for Jewish followers of Jesus, whether we're Baptists or Catholics or Eastern Orthodox Christians or Messianic Jews. Some people in Yachad B'Yeshua are just totally embedded in the Jewish world. They go to traditional Jewish synagogues. It's this entire spectrum of Jewish followers of Jesus who fall anywhere along the spectrum. And there's no oh, well, everybody really should be Catholic or everybody really should be Messianic Jews. It's just all of us coming together, wrestling with a similar set of questions that looks very different from our different vantage points and communities. But it has been, so Mark Kinzer and Antoine Levy meet in 2008. They create in 2010 something called the Helsinki Consultation, which is this smaller group of scholars that are Jewish followers of Jesus from different ecclesial traditions that get together for the next 8 years always dreaming of creating a larger community, a global community of Jewish followers in the form of this fellowship called Yachad B'Yeshua, which is, again, a community for Jews who follow Jesus and wrestle with all of the questions that we've been talking about: identity, praxis, community, family, all the things. Like, how do we deal with it when, you know, Jewish holidays conflict with Christian holidays, or how do we make sense of these aspects of rabbinic that has come up over and over again in Yachad B'Yeshua gatherings, is that we all find ourselves experiencing a kind of existential loneliness. That's the term, existential loneliness. Like, Jews who follow Jesus tend to feel kind of misunderstood, kind of isolated, whether they're in churches, sometimes even within the Messianic Jewish movement, we find ourselves like not feeling totally at home, or, you know, within the larger Jewish world. And so it's just a really neat community that's become has always been since the early days of the Helsinki consultation, which I was involved in from the beginning. It's just this utterly meaningful community for me, because it's all of these people who sort of understand the tensions, not only on this like abstract theological level, which is also important, but on this very visceral, personal identity level. And it's just this remarkable group of people. So I encourage people to check it out. We're sort of maybe trying to develop this like friends category, so people who aren't Jewish followers of Jesus but want to participate or support the organization can in a structured way. But it's really just getting off the ground. It's a membership organization. And I find it to just be this incredible community.
Yeah, I'll put a link to the website in the description. Y'all can check it out, along, of course, with Jen's books. But so you're working on a friends category. Are there any kind of resources on the website, like I don't know, like newsletters, anything that people can sign up for if they're trying to follow it or okay, good.
Yes, totally. There's all kinds of like links and resources on the website. You can sign up to be on the mailing list, and you can, I mean, right now we're sort of taking a break. We used to do as an organization these like monthly webinars that like anybody can come to and just like hear people talking about different interesting topics related to everything that you and I have been talking about. So we're kind of taking a pause from the webinars right now, trying to figure out how to move forward as an organization, but there is definitely a mailing list that anybody can sign up for if these are, you know, interesting conversations and topics that you would like to be a part of.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, definitely encourage everybody to check it out. That's great. Well, thank you so much, Jen. Really a treat to talk with you, as always. Just really excited for the work you're doing. I'm excited to join Yachad B'Yeshua soon, because I love everything you guys are doing there. Appreciate your scholarship, and thanks for this rich conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much, Max.
Thanks.
Thanks so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please make sure you subscribe using the link below and check out some more of our videos.